From the Toronto Star, I'm Rajan Mudler, and this matters. Let's call it a coup de Trump.
So this was very sad to say it. This election was rigged, and we can't let that happen. We can't let it happen for our country, and this election has to be turned around.
While many are arguing over exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump's intentions amount to in the weeks since the election, he has clearly taken some extraordinary actions to try and maintain power and overturn the legitimate results of the popular vote of the American people. The seeds of doubt he has poured into the electoral process may have untold ramifications for future contests, as well as the immediate aftermath, as America seems more divided than ever. Also, how does the Republican Party move forward after hitching their star to the celebrity president? With the transition seemingly, although reluctantly, underway, the questions now are, does Trump break more things on the way out? And really, what is the next act for the reality show president? Edward Keenan is the Star's Washington bureau chief, and he joins us to discuss Trump's post-election tactics and what's next. Ed, it's always good to chat with you. Thanks for being on the show again.
So good to chat with you too, Raj.
Let's just start, which I think is a perfect spot for this. You know, we are in America right now where people can't seem to agree on the facts. And one of the interesting things that people are arguing about is whether Trump's tactics amount to a coup attempt or not. What do you think about that?
Mostly when we think about a coup, we think of a military coup, which is using the existing military, getting them on their side, getting them to take over the government. This is obviously not that. But I've spoken and heard from enough experts who call this a coup attempt, who basically are saying when you attempt to steal an election, claim victory in an election, and remain in office, contrary to the will of the voters, that's what this is. And I think whether or not people are comfortable calling it a coup, it has been a very straightforward attempt by Donald Trump and parts of the Republican Party that are loyal to him to find a way to discredit the election results and to get him to stay in office. Now, it hasn't been a particularly competent coup attempt or a particularly well thought out one necessarily. He spent a lot of time preparing before the election, claiming that there would be massive problems with mail-in voting and all of that, which, to be clear, there's no evidence there were any such problems. And afterwards, he sort of launched a bunch of unsuccessful court challenges.
We have to turn the election over because there's no doubt we have all the evidence, we have all the affidavits, we have everything. All we need is to have some judge listen to it properly without having a political opinion or having another kind of a problem, because we have everything. And by the way, the evidence is pouring in now as we speak.
Made wild allegations. And just within the last week, really, came down to the core plan, which was to try and get Republican-controlled state legislators to just set aside the ballot box results and declare him the winner and give the Electoral College votes to him. That also was unsuccessful. I mean, I think this was an attempt to remain in office despite the expressed, fairly decisive will of the voters. So whether you want to call that a coup or not, it is what it is.
As he likes to say about COVID, and sure sounds like it to me. But anyways, I think what is really sort of important here is that there always used to be this romantic idea in U.S. politics about putting country before party, which is one of the things that happened with Nixon. But obviously this seems quaint and dead now because the Republican Party served as enablers to a lot of this. What does this say about that party? And also, where does this leave them?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I would say that on the note of putting country over party, Tim Alberta of Politico magazine has a really good essay that just went up very recently this week on Wednesday. And he profiles this sort of one state elections board Republican in Michigan who sort of decided that things were not going to go off the rails there. A lot of other Michigan Republican Party people essentially followed Trump's lead, and immediately after the election, like before the votes were even counted, began doing everything they could to derail the process there, to basically sabotage their own Michigan election result in order to try and create confusion that would allow Trump to declare victory. This guy, he's one of the people who's supposed to certify the vote statewide in Michigan, the sort of last step to make the victory official there. And he was under intense pressure from his fellow Republicans to delay the vote certification on all these sort of trumped up pretenses so that then Rudy Giuliani could kind of fight it in the courts so that they could create more chaos and the potential for basically Michigan be essentially stolen. And he essentially was having none of it. So there's one sort of profiling courage. It's very well written. I recommend it at Politico magazine, of an ordinary obscure guy, so obscure that after reading the story, I still can't remember his name offhand. I apologize. But who did exactly that. He put country over party, and he may have no future in the Republican Party in Michigan right now because of that. And that's sort of the problem, that a lot of what would otherwise be considered moderate Republicans across the country, typically traditionally be considered moderate Republicans across the country, are in this kind of bind now, because not just in this election, but for the last 4 years, the GOP was basically the grand old party. The Republicans were essentially taken over by Donald Trump and remodeled in his image. And every other principle that they would traditionally claim to stand for had to take second or third or fourth place behind blind allegiance to Trump and support for him no matter what, right? Trump uber alles, before all else. And that's continued to be the case since the election, where lots of people, lots of Republicans who will privately say, and even halfway walk up to expressing the idea that this is over and Trump needs to do what's best for the country and concede, then when push comes to shove, will repeat his claims that there's serious fraud, or at least they'll say, well, there's something here we have to look into, and we can't know who the winner is yet, and let's let these court processes play out. And they're trying to avoid crossing him. And the problem is now that this attempt that Trump has made has not been successful, at least so far, and it appears it will not be successful in allowing him to remain in power. But it has been successful in convincing essentially a majority of Republican voters out there that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, that a cabal of deep state power brokers and the Democratic Party and even Republican governors and senators who certified these votes and whatnot, that these people stole the election, that they have corrupted the election process entirely. And Trump, out of office, is going to continue to be the sort of cult leader of that massive group of voters who make up the majority of Republican voters. And he's going to continue to claim that this was stolen from him. He's going to continue to exercise massive sway over the Republican Party. And so we're coming back around to that question that you asked specifically, which is that, like, the recent past of the Republican Party is Trump, but there's a good chance that the immediate future and potentially for the next 4 or 8 years of the Republican Party is Trump loyalists too. And in the meantime, they've managed to torch all kinds of the faith in the electoral system that they need to succeed, faith in the government systems that they continue to run in the states, faith in anything beyond this one man.
This is one of the things I just don't get. The weird thing about discrediting the election process for politicians is that you need it.
This is a very important moment in the history of our country. And we're talking about, very importantly, many more ballots, many more votes than the number we need. In other words, if we needed 50,000 votes, we're not talking about we found 9 dead people that voted. Of course, there were many more than that, many numbers that nobody even believes.
It's the only way to this job, and in a very practical manner. Now, all eyes are back on Georgia for the Senate runoffs, which could hold like the real balance of power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 Senate seats in Georgia. Both were up for election in this election. And both have a system where if no candidate gets 50% or more of the vote, there's a runoff. And so there's a runoff election for both Georgia Senate seats happening in early January before the inauguration. And whoever wins those 2 seats basically controls the Senate. And the way the system of checks and balances in the United States works means that if the president and the Senate and the House of Representatives are all in the same party, then it's like a majority government in Canada. The president and his party can sort of pass the legislation they want. If the Republicans continue to control the Senate, They will be able to block court appointments, block legislation. Joe Biden will have a real hard time doing what he wants to do without making deals with Republicans. And so everything now comes down to Georgia. And right now you have actually some Trump supporters, including a super PAC, a funding political organization run by an ally of Donald Trump's, campaigning in Georgia. These are Republicans, Trump supporters, saying, instead of voting for the Republican candidates in Georgia, let's get revenge on them for voting for Biden or certifying the vote for Biden by writing in Trump's name on those Senate ballots. And the effect of that would be, if a lot of Republicans do that the Democrats win and take control of the Senate. And so you can see that this kind of logic is not just a matter of whether people are willing to put country over party, which I think is a high principle, and that's something else that's important for people in public life to think about. But it's even a matter of whether you'll put the party before its leader. And the answer here appears to be no, is that there are a significant number of people who are like, Georgia's Republican governor and Republican state legislators had the audacity to certify the legitimate vote of the people of Georgia rather than throwing that out and cheating on Trump's behalf. And so in response to that, we should basically burn down our Senate chances. I don't necessarily guess that that's actually going to be a widespread phenomenon. I don't know how many people are going to write that in, but that's a major issue right now. And there are organizations that control millions of dollars worth of advertising funding on behalf of the Republican Party, essentially, who are pushing that line right now. And I think it shows you how far along that spectrum that party has gone.
We'll be right back. It is kind of crazy to me because, like I said, we're about to do this all over again, at least on a much smaller scale. But I'm going to give you the classic, what I shouldn't do, the double-barreled journalism question. What's Trump's next move in office? There's lots of talk of him breaking things on the way out, a whole raft of pardons potentially. But also then, what about the rumors about his next move when he's out of office? There's lots talking about him starting a right-leaning media empire to rival Fox News. Let's take both those things there. What do you think the next couple of months and then looking beyond that?
Well, let's start with the next couple of months. I mean, Donald Trump has still not conceded the election, but it seems like the moves that both his administration has signed off on and whatnot, and what his supporters, those close to him in the White House, have been saying all along is that, he's not going to concede that he lost, but he's probably going to go without the military is not going to have to go out there and remove him forcibly. He's going to leave. But on the way out, he's still president until January 20th, when the new president is inaugurated. And there's a lot of things that he can do between now and then that will, cement some of his policy goals. He's already begun mass waves of firings of people who were seen as disloyal to him and installing his loyal people in those places. A high-profile example of that is the Secretary of Defense. However, the Secretary of Defense is going to leave on January 20th anyway. But in the meantime, those loyalists there could potentially, some people are talking about destroy records that could be incriminating against Trump, or, fire career civil servants there, make last-minute orders. The more stuff you do, the more houses you set on fire, the harder it is for the fire department that arrives to put them all out and put them all out quickly, right? So we could also see these newly installed sort of Trump department heads and whatnot, but also Trump himself through executive orders and administration actions. And we see this a little bit with Iran and in the Middle East and on foreign policy is make decisions and implement new policies, lots and lots of them that are the kinds of things that Trump would like to do, but do them all very quickly. And then it adds to the number of things that if Biden wants to reverse those policies, he has to sort of undo them all individually, right? Beyond that, I have not spoken to people who told me this directly, but I've read from a lot of credible journalists in the last 24 hours that Trump is planning to pardon Flynn. He may also pardon other people who were caught up in the investigations into Trump, other people who were otherwise loyal to him. There's been talk about him trying to pardon himself, which there are some questions. I think there's an active debate in U.S. constitutional scholarship about whether a president can pardon himself. It seems maybe he can. It would be seen as illegitimate by a lot of people, and pardon himself for a crime he hasn't been charged with yet, right?
He's just getting ahead of the game.
Yeah, I mean, to receive a pardon, you don't need to have been convicted or even charged with something. The president can preemptively pardon somebody else. Gerald Ford did that for Richard Nixon in the 1970s. And so, there's some talk about whether he would preemptively pardon himself for the kinds of crimes he thinks his successors or the attorney general afterwards would prosecute him for, related to Ukraine, related to the sort of self-dealing provisions where he has directed money to his own hotel chains and whatnot through the Secret Service. There's a number of those things. So those are all possibilities. And I think nothing we know about Donald Trump, I don't think it's going too far out on a limb, even for Trump supporters, to agree that nothing we know about Donald Trump makes you think he's the kind of guy who would hold off on doing a lot of things because he thinks his successor has the right to make those decisions for him. He's the kind of guy, and he's already showing that he is, going to implement as many policies as he can to make it as difficult for Biden to succeed him and change course as he can. And I mean, the Treasury Department just took hundreds of millions of dollars of emergency COVID relief money that was not yet spent. It was made available as a emergency funding pool for the Treasury Department to spend as it sees fit to help relieve these COVID emergencies, right? And the Treasury Department just put that back into a type of fund, returned it to a fund that will now require Congress to approve taking it back out and using it again. That's just a small example. The Treasury Department could have just left that money where it is, allowed their successor to have access to hundreds of millions of dollars in already approved emergency money in case this winter's COVID situation is as devastating as it might be to businesses and to employees and whatnot. But instead, now the Trump administration they've engaged in what's just strictly a formality to put that money into a place where now it will require Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, to sign off on allowing the administration to access it. So that's one of dozens and dozens of things we expect of exactly that type of thing for Donald Trump to do. Then after he leaves office, it's not clear yet. What is very clear, he's been talking privately with his advisors. We hear lots and lots of credible reports that he's been talking about running again in 2024. And whether or not he actually runs again, he'll be getting quite old by that time. But whether or not he actually runs again, it's clear he intends to continue exerting his leadership of the Republican Party through the next election. And he may do that. People have been talking about, he's really angry at Fox News recently because they called Arizona very quickly on election night, and he thinks that sabotaged his chance of spinning his story of that he actually won more effectively. That's a very complicated digression to get into, but he's merely mad at Fox News, especially now that they've mostly recognized Joe Biden as the legitimate president-elect. There's talk of him teaming up with Newsmax or OAN or one of the other sort of far right-wing media, sort of mostly online video media outlets, and building them up as a competitor to Fox News. He might do that, and I don't have particular insights into, how eager he would be. I don't have insider information on how eager the president is or is not to actually get into the business of running a news media empire as a figurehead or as an executive or otherwise. But, he almost doesn't need to do that if he doesn't want to. He could host a radio show, or he could be a frequent everyday guest on other people's right-wing radio shows and just sort of continue being out there, being the commentator. If you look at his presidency, and I've been following it closely for more than a year now, and less closely, but with interest for longer than that, and it seems like the parts of the presidency that he enjoyed quite a lot were the public-facing ones where he got to stand up at a microphone and talk and kind of riff and take questions that he wanted to or not, and then hosting rallies, right? Like, he loves these things. He loves being the guy out there making speeches to his faithful and stirring things up and launching criticisms, conspiracy theories, accusations against his opponents. He can do that, whether it's running a new media empire or whether it's just hosting rallies on his own and appearing on, Sean Hannity's show and radio shows. He can continue just making those sort of daily or weekly addresses to his faithful, completely unchained for any responsibilities of the office. And through that, basically be the leader of the opposition across the country. And through that, basically maintain control of the Republican Party. And whether then, if he wants to run in 4 years, if one of his kids wants to run, if he's going to be the sort of kingmaker who lends his endorsement to whoever eventually runs, he keeps a lot of options open by just setting himself up to be that guy. And the specifics of it will be interesting to see how it plays out. But the specifics of whether he runs his own media outlet or teams up with an existing media outlet to have his own show, or just runs sort of Trump Inc. from Mar-a-Lago, his resort in Florida, where he's going to live with his wife when he leaves the White House, to sort of be the president in exile and leader of the Republican Party. It'll be interesting to see how he does it, but that's what he's very likely to do, is sort of the more top line thing than how exactly he's going to wind up doing it.
I think the bottom line is we know that he's probably not going to go anywhere.
Not quietly anyway.
Not quietly, for sure. And this is fantastic for us. I really, really want to thank you for your time and all your work during the election and for talking to us so much throughout it.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
Ed Keenan is the Washington Bureau Chief for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajat Budhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.